All right, so as you probably know, we are in the middle of a series on the life of David. David, as we talked about from the very beginning, there's more material on David than any other character, not just in the Bible, but in ancient history. And so there's a lot to get into. We're going to have spent 8 weeks total in the life of David. But we've seen David, we said his a life of 3 acts. Act 1 is kind of David the shepherd boy. And David is the season in which he kills Goliath and he begins his ascent. He's anointed as the future king of Israel. And then the envy and the jealousy of Saul drives David away and he becomes a fugitive. He's kind of this outlaw and he's forced to live in the wilderness. And he has that wilderness time we talked about last couple of weeks, that the wilderness is a time when God uses to shape us, to refine us for his purposes and his plans. And the wilderness might be a wasteland, but as we said, in God's economy, it is never a waste of time. And so today now we move into that third act. So maybe if this is your first time with us and you kind of think, well, I have missed all this. Well, we're still kind of at the beginning of a new part of David's life. So you really are here at a great time for this because we're seeing David kind of move now into his place as king. And so he of course, has been chased into the wilderness by Saul. Saul, over the years, his envy just drives him deeper and deeper into madness. And then you have in chapter 31 of 1 Samuel, the Philistines muster for another attack. Of course, the Philistines were kind of the common enemy. They're the most usual enemy of Israel. And so they muster for an attack, and Saul goes out to meet them. And even though, here's the thing, even though it's a battle he knows he cannot win. I mean, the odds are clearly stacked against him. But he doesn't care. It really is a suicide mission. It's his last stand. He knows that. And so he basically uses the battle as the opportunity to take his own life. And in the end, Saul is dead. His 3 sons are dead. And I think it says about 3,000 of his own men are dead. So Saul's death finally opens the door for David to sit on the throne. But that didn't make it easy. Because while Judah, now let me back up and say, Israel is kind of 2 sections. There's the southern section known as Judah and the northern section known as Israel, okay? And that's a little confusing. But Judah and the tribes of Judah, they recognized David immediately as king. But Saul still had a descendant in Israel, and those guys, they banded around him. And so even though Saul was dead, there was then this civil war that took place and which David ultimately triumphed. And so they finally gather under his authority and make him king. So he's now the king of a united country. And his first act as king is to establish a base of operations. He has to establish a capital. And he's wanting a place that will serve him well, both politically and militarily. And so he turns his eye to Jerusalem. Jerusalem was perfect because Jerusalem wasn't so far north that it would offend anybody in Judah. It wasn't so far south that it would offend anybody in Israel. It was kind of right in the sweet spot of the middle ground. So it was a great place politically, but it was also a perfect place militarily because Jerusalem at the time was considered to be an impenetrable fortress. It held the high ground walls, and so nobody was able to ever conquer Jerusalem. And so David and now his army shows up at the gates of Jerusalem, and Jerusalem at the time was occupied by people known as the Jebusites. And so the Jebusites come to the walls and they say, "You cannot get in here. Even the blind and the lame can ward you off." And they thought to themselves, kind of this inner dialogue, David cannot get in here. They're very confident in the fact that David cannot get in here, almost arrogant that David cannot get in here. Even the blind and the lame can ward you off. I don't know about you, but every time I read this story, every time I read that passage, I get a picture in my mind. Does this picture seem familiar to you? That's exactly that's what I think of when these guys are at the wall and they're just yelling at David in bad French accents. "You cannot get in here. Even the blind and lame can ward you off. David cannot get in here." And then I love it, the very next verse, David captured the fortress. So he basically took care of business. And so David now sets up as king, finally he's king, and he sets up his capital, his base of operations right there. So he's kind of moved in from shepherd to outlaw, now finally Act 3, king. So David sets up his court in Jerusalem, and one of his first official acts as king was to bring what is called the Ark of the Covenant out of storage and back to Jerusalem. This is in 2 Samuel chapter 6, verse 1. David again brought together all the able young men of Israel, 30,000. He and all his men went to Baalah in Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called the name of the Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim on the ark. So what was the ark? Well, most of us are familiar with the ark, of course, because of Indiana Jones went looking for it. And it was a pretty good representation physically of what we know of in Scripture, but it was a box. It was a wooden box covered in gold, and the lid of that ark, though, was a piece of solid gold, and it had two angelic features or creatures on the top of it. And so, and it held the law of God. It had the stone tablets that Moses was given. We were placed in the ark, and they carried them around with them. And so the thing about the ark was, it was with them really from the beginning. Think about this, it was a hard, physical, tangible object that tied them back to their history. It was a true reminder. They looked upon it, they saw it, they carried it, they worshiped around it. It was a reminder of God's presence. It was a reminder of God's power. It was a reminder of God's protection, his providence throughout their history. Eugene Peterson says, the ark provided, I love this, a center, giving worship a hard historical focus on the revealed character of the God whom they worshiped. A hard historical focus. I love that. This really tied them back. This was not just something they pulled out of the air, really tied them back to their history. Now, a question to ask and answer is, how does the ark differ from all the other objects and idols and statues that were so commonplace in that time? Remember, this was not a world without gods. There were gods everywhere, and every god had his own image. Every god had its own statue. Well, unlike the statues and the idols of the other religions, the ark was never meant to provide Israel with a likeness of their God. The difference is in all those other religions and all those other statues, all those other idols, when you look closely at them, what you're going to find is that those are religions and idols made in the image of man. They come out of man's creativity, they come out of man's imagination, and that's why many times they look like men, or they look like animals, or they look like some combination of the two, because and this is just a great way to understand between a false religion and a true religion, is that a false religion will always be made in the image of the man who created it. So it is man creating God in his image, which is a perversion of the whole creation story, which God created man in his image. So the ark was never meant to portray the image of God, because it was never meant to show who God was, or to give us the face or the features of God. That's why the ark was completely unique in its appearance. It looked nothing like the men who built it, because it wasn't made to reflect the image of man. The ark was, like I said, there was just this box covered in gold, with a lid of solid gold. And it did not contain the presence of God. But the other thing is the other idols, the other images, the other statues, you would go to them and say, that is my God. And they believed it really did. And that God inhabited that statue. When you stood in that idol's presence, you stood in the presence of that God. And so the ark they never believed it contained God, because God could not be contained. God could not be confined to a box. Now, the top of that ark was called the mercy seat. That's where the lid was. It was the mercy seat where God himself, his glory would manifest itself over the top of that box. It's where his presence was revealed. And a great picture of the ark is found in 1 Chronicles, and David describes the ark as, I love this, the footstool of our God. The footstool of our God. And what was a footstool? A footstool was a piece of furniture that a king would rest his feet on when he sat on his throne. And oftentimes a footstool would be carved, or there would be paintings on it that would depict the king's enemies that he had conquered, his enemies that he had vanquished in battle. And so it was kind of the ultimate sign of authority if he just would put his feet on his enemies once again. A sign of his authority, a sign of his power, a sign of his glory, his dominion. And so so when David says the ark is just a footstool of our God, as ornate and beautiful as it was, basically David was taking a shot at all the other gods. So all the other people would say, hey, this is our God, and they would point to an ornate statue. And David basically says, oh, that's cute. This here, though, this ark, this is not our God. This is not even our God's throne. This is where our God props up his feet. This is his footstool. And to get an idea of the ark, let's talk a little bit about its history. About 20 years before this moment, the Israelites and the Philistines were once again fighting. There was a battle, and it was a bad day on the battlefield for Israel. They lost 4,000 men, and so they retreated kind of to lick their wounds. And the elders got together and like, what's going on here? What can we do to turn the tide of this battle? And they had the bright idea. We need to bring the ark up. We need to bring the ark into our camp, right? Because they asked the question, why did the Lord bring defeat on us today before the Philistines? And they say, well, it's because we don't have God's presence with us. We don't have God's presence with us and his provision for us in our camp. So he says, let's bring the ark of God's covenant from Shiloh so he may go with us and save us from the hand of our enemies. So they brought the ark out, and they brought it into the camp of the army. And it says that when the ark came into the camp, the Israel, I mean, you can imagine, now they think God's on their side. The presence of God is with them, and there's a mighty roar that erupts from the Israelite camp, and it terrifies the Philistines on the other side of the battlefield. But it doesn't last long, because they go to war the next day with the ark in the camp, and it says the Israelites were defeated and every man fled to his tent. The slaughter was very great. Israel lost 30,000 foot soldiers, and they even lost the ark because the ark of God was captured. The ark was brought up to turn the tides of battle, but the ark made no difference in the battle. And so in that world, when two armies fought, and it really wasn't just men against men, it was God against God. And if you defeated your enemy, it was because your God was believed to be superior to the God of your enemy. And so the Philistines were like, well, clearly our God is superior to the Israelite God. So they captured the ark, and they carry it with them back to their capital, and they set the ark up in the temple of their God. And I love this story. This is in 1 Samuel chapter 5. It's after the Philistines had captured the ark of God, they took it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. And when they carried the ark into Dagon's temple and set it beside Dagon, right? So they took the ark and it kind of just said, the ark is now a trophy of war, symbolizing their superiority or the superiority of their God over the Israelite God. So they set it up in their temple. And it says the next day, when the people of Ashdod rose, the next day, there was Dagon fallen on his face on the ground before the ark of the Lord. So they wake up, and now Dagon is prostrate. Their God is actually prostrate before the ark of God. And they thought, oh, that's weird. So they put him back in his place. Now listen, you know you're in trouble when you have to keep propping up your God, right? And so that's what they're doing. They keep propping up their God. And it says the following morning when they rose, there was Dagon fallen on his face on the ground before the ark of the Lord. Again, it happens twice. But this time, his head, his hands had been broken off and were laying on the threshold. Only his body remained. And it goes on, it says, the hand of God was heavy on the people of Ashdod, and they were afflicted with tumors. And they said, let's get it out of here. This thing is bad news. So they sent it to a place called Gath. Remember, Gath was where Goliath was from. Gath had more plagues, more tumors. They said, let's get it out of here. They sent it to Ekron, more plagues, more tumors. The people of Ekron said, get it out of here. And they put it on a cart and just slapped the oxen. It just rode away, right? They said, just wherever it goes, we do not care where it lands. It arrives in a place called Beth Shemeth, and the guys at Beth Shemeth like, oh, this is interesting. And they open the ark, and 70 of them die. But it's by opening the ark. So these three incidences, listen, it tells us three things very clearly. The first thing is, it says that God will not allow his power to be abused. You cannot use God for your own purposes. You cannot use God for your own plans. That's what the elders of Israel, That's what they tried to do. They said, we're going to bring God in and God's going to save us. And they presumed that God was going to bless them. They just presumed that God was in this. And so they basically used God like a talisman, right? This is superstition. And for a lot of people, that's what Christianity still continues to be. I wear my cross, I put my shirt on, whatever it is. And it's to ward off the evil of the world. And if I do the right things and say the right things and go through the right motions, then God's going to do good things to me, all right? And all we're wanting to do is we're just wanting to co-opt God's authority for our own purposes, our own plans. And so they tried to leverage, ultimately, they tried to leverage the glory of God for their own pursuit of glory. And God would have none of it. He's not a tool to be used. And so he said, he brought the ark, but it made no difference because he withdrew his power. He withdrew his presence. So he will not allow his power to be used for our purposes. Second thing is he will not allow his worship to be shared. Right? That's what happens in the temple, right? When they put the ark of God next to Dagon, the god of the Philistines, and they just basically add God to their menagerie of gods, like he's one of all the other gods. And I think sometimes we can be like that. We can be like Philistines in that we just want to add God. God is an accessory. He's an accoutrement, right? We add him onto all our life. He's not the centerpiece of our life. He's not the focal point of our life. We just put him in the temple of our heart with all of our other gods, whatever that may be. Now, we don't call them gods anymore, but all the other little idols of our heart. Like Calvin said, I mean, the human heart is an idol factory. And so we may not be bowing down to false idols or statues, but there are still idols that take God's place in our heart. And these things have to fall before our God. And so he will not allow his worship to be shared. And the second thing is, or the third thing is, the 70 guys who died at Beth Shemesh, that tells us that God will not allow us to take his presence lightly. So we have to have respect and reverence when we come into his presence. So the ark ends up at a place called Kiriath Jearim in the house of a guy named Abinadab. So that's where it sat for the last several years. And so David establishes Jerusalem as the center of Israel, right? And it's the center of all things. It's the political center, it's the economic center, it's the military center. But as great as that is, it's incomplete because it's also meant to be the center of all worship for all of God's people. And it was missing this one last piece, which was the ark. So unlike the elders, I really do not believe David was using the ark for his own purposes. He wasn't looking for the ark so that he could have the blessing of God's presence. He already knew he had been blessed, right? He had been chosen by God. Clearly, God was with him, been blessed by God. So this was not a move of desperation. I really do believe this is one of adoration. He wants to worship God. He wants to bring God back to the center for his good of his people, right? So 20 years, the ark is sat kind of in this house as a kind of a forgotten piece of a religious furniture. It's like the family Bible that sits on our shelf. And it's kind of just, it does us no good. It just sits there. And it's sat there for the last 20 years. And so David wants to bring it back and make it center, not for his good, but I believe for the good of his people. So he gathers 30,000 men. They make all these plans. We're going to see this in a minute. All these plans, 30,000 men, and they have this huge procession. And they show up at Abinadab's door. You imagine that day? There's like, Abinadab opens the door, and there's the king and 30,000 people standing behind him. Like, we hear you have the ark. Yeah, you do. So they came to reclaim and to restore the ark. Now, verse 3 says, they set the ark of God on a new cart and brought it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. Uzzah and Ahio, sons of Abinadab, were guiding the new cart with the ark of God on it, and Ahio was walking in front of it. David and all Israel were celebrating with all their might before the Lord. Now, remember this is key, with castanets and harps and lyres, timbrels, sistrums, and cymbals. So this was not a procession. This was a celebration. It's not just like a religious parade. It's kind of like a party. And everything's going well until you get to verse 6. And when they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, it says, Uzzah reached out and took hold of the ark of God because the oxen stumbled. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverent act. Therefore, God struck him down, and he dies there beside the ark of God. And you're like, okay, now see, that's exactly why I can't believe the Bible, that this kind of stuff would happen. Why would God do that? Here's poor Uzzah. All he's trying to do is help. Apparently the oxen stumbled. It kind of threw the cart off of center and jolted it, jarred it. The ark slipped, and he reaches out to catch it, and he touches it, and he dies. Why does Uzzah die? Well, we assume Uzzah dies because he broke the rules, because there were some very clear rules that were attached to the transportation of the ark. Had David and anybody else cared to look, there were very specific rules. When the ark was to be moved, it was supposed to be covered by at least 3 layers of cloth to protect others from seeing it. And the ark was supposed to be carried, not put on a cart. It was intended to be carried, and it was carried by a specific group of people called the Levites. The Levites were the priests, the tribe of Israel that were the priests. All the priests came out of that tribe. And everyone had to stay away from the ark, except for the Levites, about 1,000 yards. Now, when you look at and you compare how the ark was meant to be moved, right, with all the instructions we get in the book of Numbers, to how the ark was being moved in 2 Samuel, you can see they didn't follow any of the guidelines that God had clearly laid out. So we think, well, Uzzah dies because he broke the rules. And we think, well, the message is clear, we have to keep the rules. And if we don't keep the rules, God will not bless us. Well, if that was the case, then why was Uzzah was the only one that died that day? Because everyone there had broken the rules. Well, we think, well, it's because he touched it. Well, a lot of people touched it that day. They had to put it on a new cart. The point is, all the rules had already been broken by everyone that was participating in this event. They broke the rules. They picked it up and they put it on the cart. Why wasn't everyone there that day? Why weren't they all struck down? Why didn't David himself die? Because after all, this was done under his direction. This was done under his supervision. And the reason Uzzah was the only one that died, because something else is going on here. Something else is happening here. The problem is that it wasn't that they totally ignored the rules and treated the ark without any reverence or respect. It was actually just the opposite. It was because they believed they had more than satisfied the rules. Because what I think happened here is they might have gone back and read the rules and they think, we could do better than that. And they tried to. Well, what do they have? You have a massive procession, right? All you needed by the actual rules, all you needed to transport the ark was 4 to 6 Levites. That's it. That's all you needed. David brought 30,000 young men. And none of the regulations around the transportation of the ark required any worship. In fact, it was just the opposite. The transportation of the ark was supposed to be kind of a quiet and subdued moment where it was covered and not seen. But there in the record, you have 6 different kinds of instruments with a whole lot of singing and shouting happening. And 2 times we're told that they set the ark on it was very specific, on a new cart, a cart that had been specially constructed for this moment. This is a sacred cart. It was if you would, it was a consecrated cart meant to carry the ark. So what this all tells us is this didn't just happen. This was something they planned for. It was something they thought about. And I think they were all probably even pretty proud of the plans that they had made. And they just assumed with all their extra effort that God would be pleased with this. But that's what religion always causes us to do, one of 2 things. And one of those things is to overestimate ourselves, to be overconfident of ourselves. We're kind of like the Pharisee. Like, this is what David is doing, is exactly what the Pharisee is doing. God, I thank you I'm not like other men, robbers, evildoers, or even like this tax collector. Why am I better than everyone else? Because I fast twice a week. You weren't required to fast more than twice a year, right? That's what the law said, but he's fasting twice a week. He's doing more than he's required to do. He says, I give 1/10 of all that I get. He's tithing on top of the tithe. Just like David, he's going above and beyond what is required of him. And some of us, we feel like I've gone above and beyond. Like I'm serving, I'm giving, I'm showing up, I'm devoted. I mean, God's got to be pleased with me because I'm doing more than what is expected. I'm certainly doing more than what most people are doing, and I'm doing more than what God's expecting me to do. But that doesn't get us anything. That doesn't buy us anything with God. See, when you look at the Ark of the Covenant and in comparison to the other religions and other holy relics and idols, every other religion, an idol and holy relics, you could go up and touch it. In fact, to touch it was to basically connect physically with your God, through your own effort, through your own commitment. You made a pilgrimage, you waited in line, you touched the artifact, you kissed the holy relic. But all the rules of the Ark require that you treat it in the exact opposite way. You're not permitted to reach out and just touch it. You're not permitted to grab it. The rules of the Ark were meant to communicate. It was supposed to be a physical object lesson meant to communicate the gulf between God and man, the distance, the brokenness of the relationship, the chasm between man and God. That's what it was. It was a living kind of illustration. You just can't treat God like you want to treat him. You can't just approach him the way you want to be, way you want to approach him. And you can't certainly buy your way into God's presence through your own morality or devotion or commitment. So Uzzah reached out and touched the ark. It was as if he says, I'm a good man, and I'm doing a good thing. And he thought he could overcome that distance through his own morality. He thought he could overcome that distance, that chasm, through doing a good thing. You cannot overcome the distance through devotion, no matter how good you are. That's the lesson of the ark, is that you cannot bridge the chasm. Your religion, your devotion, no matter how great, you cannot reestablish the connection that has been broken through our own rebellion. Uzzah thought he had satisfied the rules. I mean, look at all the evidence. Surely God has to be pleased. But the extra effort does not make up for what was required to approach the ark, for what was required to be in the presence of God. And it says in verse 8, then David was angry because the Lord's wrath had broken out against Uzzah, and to this day this place is called Perez Uzzah. So here he is. He's bitter. He's angry. Why? Look at all that he's done. All the expense, all the planning, all the preparation that went into this moment. And God goes and rains on his parade by killing Uzzah. And why is David angry? Well, you get angry when you think you deserve something better. And David, remember, we're looking at David because of the faith of David, but also the flaws of David. And we're learning from him. And you think you deserve something better, and when we think we deserve something better, we get mad, we get bitter, we get frustrated, we get angry. And some of you are just like David right now. You're not saying it out loud, but there is a kind of a smoldering anger in your heart towards God because you don't think God is giving you a fair shake. Like, you've done all that you're supposed to do. You've checked all the boxes. You've been devoted and committed and done everything that you think you're required to do, and God's still just not coming through for you. And that's exactly what David is feeling right then. But as horrible as this moment is, this is when something good begins to happen in David's heart. It says in verse 9, David was afraid of the Lord that day. And he said to himself, how can the ark of the Lord ever come to me? This is what's good about this, because instantly, when Uzzah dies, he sees it. He gets clarity, and he becomes aware of the reality of the distance, of the chasm, of the gulf between he and God. And David looks at this, and he's afraid. You know why? Because he's basically saying, this is the best I could do. I can't do this any better. This is the best I can do. I have gotten all the men. I've made all the preparations. I've paid all the money. We've rehearsed all the songs. This is my best, and my best is not good enough. And man, that's a hard place to be. When you come to that realization, my best religion, my best righteousness, my best morality, I can give my best, but my best is not good enough. That's a tough lesson to learn. But see, that's what I said. Like, sometimes religion makes us overconfident. We overestimate ourselves. And David now, that's coming undone. So in the beginning, he was overconfident in his ability to connect with God. Now he's underconfident. And he doesn't fall back on what he's done. Because all the effort and all the expense, he sees it now, it's worthless. And this is a hard moment. But here's what's interesting. You go back in the history of the ark, there are moments in the ark when God punishes the unbelieving. Remember what happened to the Philistines? God's hand was heavy on them. But then there are moments when the ark doesn't just punish the unbelieving. There are moments when the ark actually punishes those who are moral and good. Because what the ark shows us is that both the rebellious and the religious are condemned. So David says in verse 10, he was not willing to take the ark of the Lord to be with him in the city of David. Instead, he took it to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. You imagine if you were Obed-Edom. There's a knock at your door and like, here, can you hold this for me? It just killed a man. But here, put it in your backyard. We'll be back for it later. But look what happens. Here's what's interesting. The ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite for 3 months, and the Lord blessed him and his entire household. And God made sure David got word of this. Verse 12, now King David was told, the Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom, everything he has, because of the ark of God. And it's a reminder to David that good can come from the ark. Blessing can be found in the ark. See, the ark doesn't just communicate the distance created by our sin. It communicates that God still wants relationship and still provides a way for relationship. Then that solution to that problem, though, is only found in God. The rules weren't just on how to transport the ark. There were also rules in how you could even approach the ark. And you couldn't go into the presence of the ark until what? A sacrifice had been made and blood had been shed. That was the only way you could go into the presence. And so they realized that. And then they went back and they took the ark and they did it like they were supposed to. It says in verse 13, when those who were carrying the ark of the Lord had taken 6 steps, it says they put it down and they celebrated. Can you imagine that moment? Those 6, hey, you 4, okay? You get to carry the ark. And they're like, oh, great. Remember Uzzah? And so they all pick up the ark. They take 6 steps and they put it down. They're like, yay, we're still alive, right? Here's what I love about that. There's a picture of Sabbath in there, right? 6 days, and then you put it down, and what do? You put down your work, and you celebrate, and you worship, and you rest. So what do? They took their 6 steps, and they sacrificed. They sacrificed a bull and a fattened calf. They made a burnt offering. Every time they would make another burnt offering. They brought a sacrifice. And what was a burnt offering? When you had a burnt offering, you laid your hand on the bull or the fatted calf. And when you laid your hand on it, what you were saying is you identified with that thing, with that animal. Then you slay the animal, and then you burned it. You utterly destroyed it. And why was that important? Because there were ways there were sacrifices where you could sacrifice the animal, and then the meat could then be reclaimed and used. But when you had a burnt offering, nothing was left. Everything was given. Every part of the animal was given to God. It was utterly destroyed. And that thing, what you're saying is, I can only step in the presence of God. The only way I can be in God's presence is if something is utterly destroyed. Because if it's not that, then I will be utterly destroyed. So something has to take my place and be utterly destroyed in my place. Someone will take my place and be destroyed for me so I can be here. And then the result of it, look what happens. David was dancing before the Lord with all his might. And he actually catches flack from this. Some of those that were there that day, they criticized him for behaving in a way that was undignified. This is not the behavior of a king. But you know what I told you before? What does religion do? Religion causes us to either be overconfident in ourselves or to be underconfident, to overestimate or to underestimate, right? It causes us to think too much of ourselves, or it causes us to think too little of ourselves. And what you see there in David is a freedom of worship that occurs when he is really free. He is not thinking too much of himself anymore, and he doesn't think too little of himself. He's just set free to worship his God, and he's worshiping him with all of his might. Because he understands now the relationship of the ark and how he can approach God, and he approaches God not through his own goodness or his own devotion or through his own preparation. He approaches God because there's a sacrifice that is made on his behalf. And when we understand that, that's the picture of what Jesus ultimately came to do and be for us. He was the one utterly destroyed, so we didn't have to be utterly destroyed, so we could be in the presence of God. And when we see that, we're not proud of our religion, and we're not ashamed of who we are anymore. We're just set free to worship him, to enjoy him, to experience real joy in him that we've never had before. That's the beauty of the ark and what it meant to David, what David learned from it, and what we can still learn from it today. Let's pray together. God, we thank you for this picture, for the illustration, for how you so thoughtfully created steps and images and objects that gave us tangible, real things to understand who you are and your heart for us, your grace towards us. God, help us today. If some of us in this room, we're convicted now because we are too proud of ourselves and our religion. And some of us, we're feeling today just a sense of shame that we haven't done enough, or pride that we've done more than enough. And God, help us just to realize we come by your grace alone. You're the one that made it possible. You're the one that made it available. You're the one who was destroyed so we wouldn't have to be. And we could stand in your presence free to fully and completely enjoy you like David did that day, not caring what anyone said or what anyone thought. If we don't have that today, help us to take whatever step we need to find it, to experience it. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.